business leader looking for next? I was. Are you an athlete transitioning to next? I wasn't. If you're looking for your next, this is the space for you. This is the Business Athlete Performance Lab. Hi, I'm Keith Bilous, and this is Live in the Lab. All right. A little bit of weirdness in front of the camera there for anybody who's watching. So I'm like, hey, where's the button? Where's the button? I can't get it going. How did you go viral on TikTok? You were on America's Got Talent. How much do you get paid to be on AGT? Oh, you didn't get paid. Keith and Steve here in Live in the Lab.
You're a great interviewer. I love it.
48 miles, 48 hours. And not just once. You ain't seen nothing yet. I hit 50 last time, and I'm like, yeah, things are a little different than they were 10 years ago. So trust me, things are to keep. You have no time for the BS that much of society seems to put on the table. Why is that? Like, what you're talking about is real right now. There's just no bullshit here, but it's just real. We brought you in with some Marley. I said, Joseph, let's talk music for a second. You said, well, Keith, oldies, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I've never talked to a sir before. Why are you a sir? In many ways, we're the same story. I came from nothing. You came from nothing. I think the old saying goes that if you want a trophy, you climb Everest. If you want respect, you climb K2. I've built an island myself, and it's pretty fascinating when you can have a conversation with yourself with your own knowledge. Have you done that before? Why are we rushing to make these tools if all they're going to do is hurt humanity? Does the world need an Oppenheimer moment with AI?
What a fun show.
What's going on, Business Athlete Nation? You got your good friend. You got your accountability partner. You've got your chief accountability officer. You got the guy sitting here in the chair. What the hell? He's everything. He's always here. Hey, I'm Keith Bilous, Monday to Friday. I sit here in the chair looking into LinkedIn, looking into X, looking into YouTube, and saying, hey, everybody, welcome to Live in the Lab. Welcome to the Business Athlete Performance Lab. Welcome to the new subscribers today. Got some wonderful notes from you guys this morning. Thank you very much. Full of vitamin G as we start the day. People are liking the content. They're saying, hey, put it in my inbox. And you know how you can get that in your inbox? You go to inside.bapl.ai. Inside, INSIDE .bapl.ai. So if you're listening to this on the podcast and not viewing me right now, and to my accessibility listeners, and I think that's how it works, and I apologize if I'm not explaining that properly, but I'm gonna try something today. So I'm wearing a red shirt. I'm wearing a black Kangol toque. I'm wearing my black Lululemon pants, and I have some brown North Face snow slipper shoe type things. And I'm using that to describe myself to you. So if you're listening to this, you can kind of get a visual. I'm sitting here in the lab behind my microphone, in front of my camera. So we'll see how that comes off in post-production, but there's the old description for those of you that are wondering what the view into the lab looks like today. And, I've learned that from watching some of the fellow instructors on Peloton that's adaptability, accessibility audience. So I want to get into a topic today that is near and dear to my heart. It's this idea. Before we get into the guest, I feel like I'm all over the place today. It's Wednesday being rest and recovery day. What did you do today? How'd you hold yourself accountable? I held myself accountable by doing my yoga, went for a walk, got my movement in, and now moving to what we're going to talk about next. So the idea of a next step, important to me. Do you always think about the next step? Do you? I do. Because if you think about it, there is a next step to everything. Think about it. Everything. And before you say, wait a minute, Keith. No, this isn't a system. I'm not teaching you a system. I vowed I wouldn't do that. Look at the post from yesterday. You'll know about that whole thing. But I'm going to make recommendations. I'm going to make suggestions. You make the decision. But can you just imagine standing still all of the time? Not moving? Stagnant? Still. Time passing you by. Now, to many, this might sound like death. It does to me. To many, this might sound like life. Always reacting. Living life through reaction. Rarely proacting. Wondering how to be an entrepreneur. Maybe a want-trepreneur. Instead, I think about subtle movement. A rocking of the chair, a tick, a talk, the clock moving forward. Every hour has a minute. Every minute has a second. Every meeting has a next meeting. Hell, Every hello is a goodbye. Every goodbye has a hello. Every kiss has another kiss. Well, listen, you get the picture. But the moment you can recognize the power of a next step is the moment you are moving forward. The moment you will inevitably recognize the goals that you want to achieve, because they will be inevitable. You keep moving forward, you're going to achieve them. How do I know? Well, this was the thinking that I adopted to successfully bootstrap my startup to $30 million a year business from scratch, then sell it for $50 million. Now, the longer it takes to recognize the time it's going to take for you to move forward with the next step, the longer it takes to move forward, the longer it takes to be held self-accountable. So having a next step to everything is recognizing that life is actually a circle. It's a cycle. It's like walking. When you put one foot in front of the other, you inevitably get to your destination. It's not a race. I learned that climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. Pole, 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 one foot in front of the other. One of the biggest learnings from that trip was that the idea of a next step. And when you get into this mindset of always taking or thinking of a next step, magic happens. How do you create a habit of a next step? Well, it's always recognizing that in every situation, there's a next. You just met someone? Well, grab their contact details, send them a note, and then schedule the next time you're going to meet them. And I was like, what do you mean, can you schedule them? Yeah, do it, schedule them, because then there's a next step happening. You go into a work meeting, think about the next meeting when this one's done, because it's not one and done. Are you playing a sport right now or aspiring to play a sport right now? Well, I've been reminded by many of my athletes here in the lab, look at your license, look at your birth date. It doesn't last forever. You going out for a date with your wife? Well, be thinking of the next one. And hey, if you just finished your vacation, start thinking about the next one. Again, you get the picture. It's not easy to adopt this mindset because many distractions always arise. You just met someone, well, then you meet someone else. Before you finish meeting the person previously, this meeting ends, you go to your next one. You're an athlete that's always going to think next year's coming or there's always another team. Your vacation's over, tomorrow's Monday, you go back to work, back to the rat race. Now, these distractions are opportunities to create that pause in your day to reflect that there is a next step always in front of you. You aren't standing still. And the quicker you can get into this mindset, the quicker you're going to get to your next step. I'm Keith Bilous. You know where I sit, but you know where I'm looking next? I'm looking to our guest. We have joining us today, Jonathan Anastas. And let's bring some tunes back here in the lab. We have some Jonathan Anastas coming in, who's the CEO. Oh, there's the camera. Who's the CEO of Clash TV. What's Clash TV, you're wondering? Well, I did a little bit of research, and I want to make sure I embrace it properly, but they bring you the best in high passion sports streaming. They're the number one global destination for street basketball. So if you're looking for street basketball online, it's clear you got to find Clash TV. Clear to me you do. And it's clear you got to listen to what we're going to say next with our guest coming up. He's Jonathan Anastas. And I hope I'm saying his last name correct. So you know how this works. He's up there. I'm turning my attention over there. And we're going to bring Jonathan into the lab and have a wonderful conversation about streaming content, accountability, his journey through business, and everything like that. Let's bring Jonathan in. We're going to do this, and that. Jonathan.
Hello.
How
Thanks
are
for
you?
having me. Great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Where are you joining us from today?
Los Angeles?
Did I do a good job introducing you?
You did a great job introducing me. Thank you. And my last name was pronounced something completely differently with about 8 more syllables. My grandfather came to Ellis Island, and whoever was sitting across the desk, in the early 20th century was like, yeah, I can't figure that out. This is what your last name is now.
So did I butcher it?
No, I mean, it's become the Americanized version. I just generally say Anastas, sort of no emphasis, flat, but it was something different. I'm an immigrant like almost all of us at some point.
I'm very grateful for you to join us today. I love to delve into the guest stories here in the lab. It's my favorite part is just this introduction, meeting somebody, what their story is. I believe every person has a story to tell, and it's my job to bring it out and share with the audience and talk about it. Especially someone who's listening right now that wants to be inspired to get to their next. And you heard my monologue about that whole idea of a next, right? Of being stuck in the next step. Who is Jonathan Anastas? And how has life shaped you to become the person you are today?
Well, that's a very interesting question, right? I was quite inspired by your intro.
Thank
And
you.
I've thought about that a lot, about what's the next, and sort of this idea of how far ahead you think versus not how far ahead you think. And we can get into that. And I raise that because you sort of asked the broad question, who am I and where did I come from?
Yeah.
And the 16-year-old me never could have seen me today. It was inconceivable where the 16-year-old me would have panned out my life. If you'd asked the 16-year-old me, it was Rockstar or broke, Rockstar or nothing, Rockstar or dead, right? And then somehow I end up in this career in business, through many different steps, many different phases, successes, failures, overachievements, huge mistakes, etc. And we can delve into whatever part you want. But when I first think about when I was conscious about doing something, it was being a rock star, getting on stage, making records, when the idea was about making records, not making singles. And I did that until it didn't work for me anymore, right? And I had to find out what was next. And without sort of confusing the audience, I got another chance to go back and do that later in life, which was like a rare gift that few people get to do, is to like sort of go back to your original passion with what you've learned in life and how you would have approached things differently.
Yes.
But it's so you can never really know where you go. People can say what they want about Malcolm Gladwell. I'm a huge believer in like put in your 10,000 hours, right? Maybe I have my 20,000 hours in now, and work as hard as you can. You were born with some set of skills. You develop some set of skills that help you capitalize on those 10,000 hours. And then there's just like this incredible amount of luck, right? He talks about how a disproportionate number of billionaires was minted during the Industrial Revolution, or minted during the late 90s, or minted in the run up until the great financial crisis, right? And that's the piece that you can't account for. The way I try to offset that piece is I'm a huge believer in taking as many bats as you can, right? You talk about athletes, best hitters, in Major League Baseball get on base less than 40% of the time. So I tell my son, you got to get 1,000 at bats. You got to get 2,000 at bats. You got to get 3,000 at bats. And so one of the threads in my life has been get as many bats, right? I took as many swings in music as I could. I took as many swings in advertising agencies as I could. I took as many swings as a brand marketer as I could. And now I'm trying to take swings as a CEO.
What a simple yet effective analogy, isn't it? It's when I hear you say that, I have similar conversations with my son Jonathan about playing hockey, right? Which is the number of shifts you got to put the shifts in, you got to put the games in, and think about, when this game's over, well, you got a game tomorrow. So why are we thinking about 3 periods when there's actually 6 over the next 2 days, right? So you're right, isn't it? It's about getting in the reps, isn't it, Jonathan? It's getting in the reps.
It's hugely about getting in the reps. And here's where I'd love to hear your take on, right? Like how many steps you think ahead, right? Because I'm a big gym person. I had a 6 a.m. call this morning on the West Coast. I said, the way I'm going to get the most out of this day, I knew we had this time slotted. I'm going to take that 6 a.m. call from the car that lands me at the gym at 6:30. I get my gym done. I'm thinking about how to best complete that set. I'm thinking how to get through my workout. When it's the gym, I'm actually not thinking about tomorrow's workout or the next day's workout. I'm going to figure out tomorrow's workout based on how I feel tomorrow. Sometimes you don't even want to think about, finishing that workout. One of my favorite analogies to what you're talking about with business is I walked into a gym in Miami early last year. I walked in with a bad attitude. I hadn't slept very much the night before. I hadn't eaten properly. I walked in saying, I'm tired, I'm hungry, but I'm going to go. And I walked in with this mindset that like this mediocre workout is required to make tomorrow's workout better. First set happens. Oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Second set happens. Wow, I have a little more energy than I thought I would. Third set. Then my mind shifts. It's like, oh, this isn't going to be a bad workout. This is going to be a good workout. This isn't going to be like a necessary step to a good workout. This is going to be a good workout. And then it's like, no, this is going to be a great workout. This is going to be an incredible workout. And I finished that leg day with a personal best, walking in an hour earlier that this was a necessary second-rate workout to get to a good workout tomorrow.
It's a wonderful metaphor for the idea of just taking the next step, Jonathan, because And what I mean by that is that you could have chosen not to go to the gym that day. You weren't feeling it. You weren't set up for success. You knew it was going to be mediocre. But in your head, you knew that there was a step from yesterday, which is I got to go to the gym tomorrow. So just by showing up, and that to me is the magic of accountability, my friend, is just show up. Because if you show up, magic happens. Right.
Right.
And you're a prover of that. Just show up and you never know what's going to happen.
You never know what's going to happen. That's why I, it's funny. You always hear this, like the power of saying no versus the power of saying yes, and sort of where you sit in your career and where you should default to yes and where you should default to no. I'm very much like, as a startup CEO, in a default to yes mode. Like, I have to take out all distractions. Like, I had to go through my phone and take off like every unnecessary app. There's a bunch of things that I don't do that I would do, but in the things that are left, I default to yes, right? Am I going to fly to Chicago and take this meeting? Can I book 5 more meetings? Am I going to spend 3 days at CES or 4 days at CES in January? Because you're right. You just don't know who you're going to meet. You don't know what learning you're going to get. You don't know what spark of an idea. And you can overload on yes until like you can't, you're no longer effective. But again, as you were saying to your son, it's about sort of taking those pivots and taking those shifts or taking those reps or whatever. That is where the unlocks happen. Mm-hmm. The unlocks don't happen locked in your house. The unlocks don't happen locked in your office. The unlocks don't happen locked in your like ritual that doesn't change. The unlocks happen like outside of your comfort zone, but there's limitations to that. One of the things my wife and I disagree on is she laughs about how like it's Groundhog Day every day a little bit sometimes. We're like, I wake up and I don't remember a bad yesterday, right? And I'm not really thinking about what bad could happen Friday. I'm just really thinking about today. And so, yes, you want to take a next step, but you can be paralyzed by what happened yesterday, and you can be paralyzed about what the fear is that's going to happen a certain number of days down the road, and that distracts from maximizing today.
Brother, if I may call you that, you are speaking God's truth right now. So as an entrepreneur myself, a few times around, this time around building up the lab, and you as a startup CEO of Clash TV, I can really relate to your perspective of, oh, who's thinking about Friday right now? I'm still thinking about Wednesday and what's happening at 3:00 because I'm very much in the moment, right? So I know that I have a plan for Friday, and I know that I have next steps lined up for Friday. But like yourself, it's hyper focused, very much aware in the moment mode, isn't it, Jonathan?
It is. And I mean, you've got to prepare. So the last thing I do every night before I quit is I look at tomorrow.
Yes.
And so I have a plan for tomorrow, but I'm not actually even looking at Friday, right? I'm looking at tomorrow's calendar, but with a mindset that I'm going to wake up on the West Coast. My tech team in Sofia has been working for 8 hours. Team in New York's been working for 3 hours. Whatever plan I had for that day may change by what's in my inbox and my Slack that morning.
Yes. All right. So my audience would be angry with me if we didn't ask this question. You are a rock star. You're a musician. I freaking love music. My show always has to have music in it. I'm always playing music. It's just music's a soundtrack to life, and I'm always find ways to weave music into the themes of the show. Let's talk music, brother. You're from Los Angeles and you're a rock star. And I'm putting that in air quotes, being serious, half serious, however we want to define it. But talk about your music career, Jonathan.
Sure. I would say, obviously, first, star would be a very strong word.
Yes.
I was not a rock star. I was an early innovator and disruptor in like hardcore punk.
Yeah.
And again, that's a thread that we'll talk about. Like I've been a disruptor in a lot of industries and a lot of categories, and that's been a thread in my life about something that I think I function well in sort of disruption and kind of like managing through disruption and leveraging disruption. But so I meant a lot to a very small amount of people. A rock star means a lot to a very large amount of people.
Yes.
Right. But I had the ability to go into music when it was like in the first disruption, not the digital disruption. But it was funny because we live in this world now where it's like, do I need a record label? Do I print physical product? Right. Like, how do I get my name out there? I was in sort of an early disruption, which is like no record label in the world would sign a hardcore punk band. Yeah. So we made our own record label. No record label in the world would produce a hardcore record. So we produced our own records. We distributed our own records. We sold our own records. It was my first startup in essence.
Love it.
Right. And there were no rules. And the funny thing is, like, we had a bunch of peers, in more traditional, even punk bands who'd sit around and they'd still be like, I got to wait for that record label to show up and sign me, and I'm going to use their money to make my record, and I'm not going to go on tour until they write the tour support check. And like we came in and we made our own records and booked our own tours. And the people that were there already were a little bit like, why do people across the country know who you are and they don't know who we are? Because we got in a van and drove across country and figured out how to play every punk rock dive from one end of the country to the other. Like we use money from our day job to print 2,000 records, sell 2,000 records, and then make 2,000 more records. And you're still waiting for somebody to write you a $100,000 check. Or even the clubs wouldn't book hardcore bands. So we'd book VFW halls and book our own shows. And guess what? If you play the establishment club in that level, they pay you $50. If you book your own hall, you can make $2,000 for the same number of people. And now you can print another 2,000 records, or you can buy another Gibson Les Paul, right? And so out of necessity, we built it ourselves.
I'm pausing because I'm trying to think of the question I want to ask next. A disruptor in the punk rock industry was definitely a thing. I know we talked before air. We're of similar age. I grew up with that same era of music. I'm thinking Headstones, thinking hardcore punk music. Nobody's listening to that. Nobody's knocking on your door, right? So you had to go do it yourself. So without distribution, you created your own distribution.
Correct. We created our own distribution. We printed our own records. We found friends who went to art school to make the covers. And because there was no other way. You could sit at home and cry about what somebody won't do for you, or you can do it yourself. And as I said, that worked until it didn't. And then after a certain point, that did hit a ceiling, right? The sort of breakthrough of when bands like that started going mainstream didn't happen until about a decade after that. Right. And even then they had to put in the road. I remember playing very early shows with Rancid. Right. And now they play the size of venues that was incomprehensible to hardcore at the time. Right. Or that bands that bands like Green Day could go platinum or double platinum or 5X platinum or whatever. And I do remember sort of hitting a moment where, wow, the pain isn't worth the pleasure. The 23 bad hours a day isn't worth the one good hour a day. And I was fortunate enough that I came from the kind of background that I could go to my parents and say, that college thing that I literally said, fuck off to you, that I'm never, ever going to do. I mean, it's funny. My parents are academics. They have 6 college degrees between them. The ultimate act of rebellion that I could have done was to say, college, fuck you. Now, to some degree, I was sort of cutting off my nose despite my face, right? And after a couple of years, I went back and I was like, college, still in play, still possible? And, it was, luckily.
Ultimate fuck you, right? Academic parents, I'm going to be a punk rocker and I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to get into a van and we're going to attach every stereotype of American musicana of driving across from club to club to club, building an audience, right? That's the ultimate finger in the air.
And it was funny, right? Because it was just pre-internet. And I remember ditching school to go do something. And I'd show up 3 days later, high school. And there'd be because I started doing this when I was 15. I started playing shows when I was 15. Yeah. And they'd be you weren't in school for the last 3 days. Where were you? And I was I played Virginia Beach, Gainesville, Florida, and Washington, D.C. And they're no, you didn't. And I was oh, in fact, I did.
What did it feel like when you knew that it was time to hang up the... Were you a guitarist, bass, singer?
I was a bass player.
Bass. So what was that moment like in your head when you had to recognize that it was time to put the bass down?
It was this idea that we didn't have the talent or we didn't have the support or the experience to take it to the next level, that it was stalled, right?
How what it was, right? Was it collectively though, Jonathan, or was one guy saying in the band? How big was the band, first of all?
The band was 5 people.
What was the name of the band?
There's a band called DYS and a band called Slapshot.
Okay.
And Slapshot still plays today. I went back and played a big reunion show with them in Boston a couple of years ago, which was fun. And I've had my chances sort of a grown up to sort of, dip back into music with the backing of my corporate life that makes it a lot easier and mitigates the downside and not the, and you only get to enjoy the upside. But it was kind of a collective decision. And then when you don't have this high passion thing in front of you, the life you have to live at that point to enable this stuff isn't great. And the kind of job you have when you're a musician, you can justify because that hour a day on stage. The sort of life stage you're living in, you know, your financial situation, you can justify because of the passion and that hour you spend on stage. And when that hour on stage goes away, you're left with everything else in your life that is not the life that you want to live. Right. It kind of forces you to look in the mirror, you know, and then I was facing sort of the kind of life moving forward with sort of job opportunities moving forward that isn't where I wanted to be. And so that required a pivot, a change, another disruption, right? You know, sort of like, you know, not that I was that much older, but, you know, enter college at 20 instead of 17 or 18, like most other kids, and like having to manage that. I had this feeling in my head, like I'm behind, I'm behind, I'm behind. I need to catch up. I need to catch up. I need to catch up. Or like entering the white collar workforce at 25 instead of 22 or 24 instead of 21. I was like, I'm behind. I got to catch up. I got to catch up. I got to catch up. And that I've got to catch up drove me. I think what the me today would tell the me then, and what I tell other people is I made that feeling of being behind in my head bigger than it needed to be. And I come from an alternative background. Like, I catastrophized it a little. Like, I sort of hid what I did instead of leaned into what I did. Like, now at my age, it's become part of my narrative. Here we are talking about it. When I first entered the white collar workforce, I never talked about it. You know, I'm like covered with tattoos. When I first entered the white collar workforce, I hid the tattoos. I mean, tattoos were sort of very different then. And I laugh because my first career arc was in advertising agencies, which are supposed to be these creative, wild organizations. And I felt
I was part of one for 10 years.
so you know, so I was like, ooh, but even in an ad agency, I was like, ooh, I got to cover these tattoos. And then later in my career, you know, when I was an executive at Activision, we'd get all of our agencies together, and it felt like part of the persona was each ad agency had to have one completely tattooed creative director, hands, neck, full sleeves, like flashing, because like we must not be that creative if we don't have the guy with the full bodysuit. Right, where I like catastrophized, you know, what happens if they find out that I have all these tattoos, or like, you know. So you know, I should have leaned in more to my differences, but I was insecure, felt behind, you know, and I probably would have been happier, less insecure, done better, evenly leaning into those differences.
I find identity a fascinating topic, Jonathan, that I learn more and more about every single day I speak with guests, especially on the athletic side. A couple of things I observed from you is you talk about your insecurities about your identity and coming into the white collar workforce. Yet when I met you before the show started, and you know, you had your Chrome Heart glasses on, you got some Chrome Heart gear, and we kind of bonded over Chrome Hearts. Like, I know what that brand is, and to those that are listening, it's an edgy, it's a cool, it's a higher end brand. It's not readily available everywhere, but it is a brand that says something about the person wearing it, if I can say that with the greatest amount of respect. And I look at you, and I've met you now for the last 30 minutes. I have to think that your authenticity, and that's a word that comes up often in this lab, your authenticity, which is truly your identity, has become your superpower the more that you have embraced it.
I think that is true now. I feel like I'm the more authentic me in my 50s than I was in my 20s.
Oh, I
But
can
that
relate to that
takes
completely.
but that takes time, right? That takes confidence, and also society has changed to some degrees, at least into the sorts of things that are part of my authenticity are indeed easier to lean into than they were,
Mhm.
you know, when I started my career. And you know, I don't want to go on some tangent about Chrome Hearts, but like everything changes. Like when I entered the Chrome Hearts brand, it was like Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols and Nikki Sixx and like, you know, Guns N' Roses. And now Chrome Hearts is like Drake, you know, and like
Yes.
and Virgil Abloh, like everything evolves, right? You know.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The other thing that struck me too, Jonathan, about your story is I often speak with athletes that spend the 23 hours of their day taking care of themselves, training, you know, getting paid to go play for that 1 hour of a sport, and they get paid well to do. I will put that on the table. I don't want to offend any of my athlete friends. Whereas your life was slogging it out for 23 hours, trying to make some money so you can go play a show for an hour, which was all of the love that you have. Like, I find it very opposite to that athlete life. Do you follow what I'm saying?
I do, but here's where I'll say that it's the same. think about my slogging out in the clubs as the athletes' high school years, their college
Of course.
years.
Okay. Yes.
Right, because ultimately, while we couldn't see it then, Green Day ultimately got a check that wasn't dissimilar
Mhm.
than a professional athlete doing kind of the same thing, right? I mean, that the how high the mountain was when I did it was smaller, right, than it became later. But when I got a chance to go back and do it again, which was purely for love, not for money, like even my genre of music scaled to the point where, and again, like I have no misnomers about my level of fame, but because of the rise of the festival,
Yes.
right? Like not because of like the brand of the festival versus the brand of me, I was able to go back and relive it playing in front of 10,000 people, 20,000
Very
people
cool.
because of the festival, right? And again, I mean, that's a whole other thing we could talk about, the whole insecurity again slash manicness of like playing in front of a festival 20,000 people one day, and then in a club the next day when you're headlining, and you're lucky if there are 150 people there, or it's some bad night and there's 50 people there, and like you're about to go on stage and you can't wrap your head around the fact that there was 20,000 people yesterday and there's 100 people today, and somehow you have to muster the same excitement to go out where you feel like an abject failure compared to like the night before.
One of my partners in the lab here, NHL great Dale Weiss, played 10 years in the NHL, 13 years of professional hockey, goes from Friday night in the Bell Center, 20,000 people cheering him on, names on the back of his jersey, to saying, Keith, fuck man, I play with four of my buddies playing Friday night beer league hockey with nobody in the stands cheering me on. So when I've heard his story, and I can only imagine what that must feel like in your head, going from one to the extreme other.
Yeah. And and your ability to adapt to all that and like rise to the highest level you can at that moment
Yes.
is, I think, what separates success from failure and mental health from lack of mental health. I mean, I've even had to do that professionally. So, while I was, sort of only a corporate VP, at Activision, I was pulling levers that had billions of dollars attached to them.
Right.
Right. Or like if I saw a creative agency with like a great idea, if we dreamed it, we could do it. Like that was the amazing thing about Activision, right? Like
Do you find joy in pulling those levers of affecting billions of dollars, or is that just because you strike me as somebody where, yeah, it was fun to pull them, but that really wasn't my passion, pulling those levers?
Oh, no, it was my passion for a couple of reasons. It was my passion because, like, in the same way that I was a musician that wasn't happy playing in front of 100 people, like every artist wants their art out in front of the most amount of
Yes.
people.
Yes.
Like, it is super cool to work on something that literally is a cultural phenomenon, right? That, like, if you think about launching a Call of Duty or launching a Guitar
Yes.
Hero, and that, like, you can, what didn't excite me was like, okay, like this idea of a number with 8 zeros behind it, but the idea that like you are moving culture, and you're moving culture at that scale, and that there likely isn't a musician you can't partner with for Guitar Hero. There likely isn't an actor who will appear in your Call of Duty commercial. If your agency has some crazy idea that you're going to build a world for one of your games really inside Google Maps, and like 6 months later that exists, like that really was a passion of mine, and that was exciting. And it's a different kind of hard in a startup. I don't have, you're trying to impact the same level of cultural shift with far fewer resources, and I would be lying if I was saying it's as easy, right? It's harder, and you have to temper, to some degree I had to temper my expectations of outcome,
Mhm.
right? That like if you set this thing up that like I'm going to pull these little levers and I'm going to be the number one trending thing globally in 25 countries on social media the next day, that is very unlikely to happen.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you're going to go into some horrible depression if that's your expectation, and you do that 5 times and it doesn't happen.
So I'm going to set the audience expectations here and Jonathan's expectations. I can already see the overtime bell going off. So we are going to be going a little overtime today. I can tell because I haven't even got Clash TV. We're still talking Michael Jonathan's Rockstar life. And now I want to get to cool stuff that's also really interesting to our audience and to me, like Activision, Atari. Like those are some cultural companies you've worked for. So were you part of Guitar Hero?
I was part of Guitar Hero. I was part of the tail end of Guitar Hero, and then the rebirth of Guitar Hero in 2015. So I got to
Cool.
see the tail end of the original sort of magic, and then we go back to disruption. We had to try to reinvent it for the streaming era, and in essence, reinvent Guitar Hero as the first sort of real music streaming game, as opposed to like this idea of something that's like locked on a disc. Again, I would sort of say the through lines here from music to Atari to Activision to Clash TV are A, managing disruption across industries, and B, this idea of culture with a big C being an accelerant to, the economic pursuits of Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, whatever generation you're in. And what I mean by that is, video games became the cultural currency along with sports and esports and all that other stuff. And sports has always lived there. And the disruption we're managing at Clash TV is, so when I first entered the sports world, sports were like the last AAA content that lived on linear television, right? All your movies had already moved to streaming. All your favorite TV shows had already moved to streaming. Your short form viewership was all on social and streaming. But sports still hung around on cable and on broadcast as recently as 2018, 2019. And it was the lagging indicator, right? The money was too big. There wasn't the same level of cultural disruption to push it. COVID happened. Then sports enters the disruption that I had lived in music, that I'd lived in video games, that I'd lived in other kinds of streaming. And like when I joined One Championship in 2019, almost all of our top media rights deals globally were linear TV. In America, we were on Turner, on TNT. When I exit the company in 2022, it's Amazon in the US, right? It's the whole thing is pivoted. And at the level below that, if you think about like the biggest stuff that was on network TV, that's all moved to Apple TV, that's moved to Amazon, that's, you move to other places at the highest level, at the FANG level. The level below that, we talk about street ball, we talk about sort of second tier MMA, other sports, they were living on cable. When the AAA sports moved away, that broke the cable bundle. The cable bundle finally broke, right? It looks like, what physical product used to look like in the music business at the late 90s, early aughts. And so all this stuff that used to live on cable, Bally Sports Network, Chapter 11, Warner Discovery, Zaz is selling as RSNs. So all this sort of like high passion stuff that had a cable home and isn't big enough to be economically viable for Amazon, Apple, now needs to build a direct to consumer model. Now needs to do what music did, right? Where we were disintermediated, right? And you have to like sort of build a relationship with the consumer. You're not buying your music through a record store. You're not buying your music through a chain store. You're not buying it at Best Buy. You're not buying at Target, right? You're getting it directly somewhere. And went through with gaming, right? Where we used to sell a packaged good and, then we sold a downloadable. And now, now I'm deep in the models on like, hey, is the Utah Jazz making more or less money than when they were on cable TV? And how can I tell Rutgers and Dykeman and IWC and these street ball leagues that used to get like their top few games streamed, every season on the Yes Network or the MSN network, about why it's economically better for them to be in business with us and build these direct to consumer relationships where fans can donate as they stream, fans can buy subscriptions, fans can buy microtransactions. When you get into NIL stuff and all those NIL unlocks, right, that these players can, build businesses around their name, image, and likeness in a way at a tier below the pros that the pros control too much, right? Like, I mean, we've all seen this stuff at the highest level, right? You're an athlete, you can go do a television commercial, but you can't wear your uniform, right? Because the league and your team control the uniform. At the level down, a bunch of those blockers don't exist. And so what we're trying to do is figure out what sports look like to help these. In essence, I look at the players at Rutgers and Dykeman of like me in a van, 20 years ago. Like, for whatever reason, they either didn't last in the NBA or they couldn't make the NBA or they didn't have the means to go play at a D1 school, but basketball was their passion and they don't want to stop playing basketball. How can I extend that career, make sure they don't have to have 3 jobs, 4 jobs, that some of that sacrifice for their skill and passion goes away because we have these direct to consumer models. Like those are the things that I'm trying to unlock every day at Clash TV.
So for our listeners, Clash TV is an online streaming platform for street ball, right? Is all sports, Jonathan, or street ball is the primary?
We're going to do other sports as we grow. Today, the great bulk of the content's around street ball. New York City street ball, Los Angeles street ball, etc. We're just piloting. Can we do what we've done for street ball with elite high school basketball? So we've piloted half a dozen high schools. I live in Los Angeles for some of this prep school ball. These teams have like 200,000 Instagram followers, right? Where LeBron's kids play, right? People tune into that. It's a big deal. And so can we build that model for high school basketball? We're doing it for MMA. But I think, MMA is another example, right? For every Conor McGregor, it's like professional wrestling or MMA. For every Conor McGregor or like, The Rock, there's a whole tier of athletes who are getting in the rental car every day and driving 300 miles and like making a paycheck that's not very good, that can run a long way. Like we all remember Mickey Rourke and The Wrestler, right? Like, and I think these direct to consumer models can make that level of all these sports more humane, more profitable, extend careers, give back to these athletes who have like literally sacrificed their bodies and their lives for this thing that they're passionate about.
Well, and I like that you've embraced like technologies, Web3 technologies, digital technologies, because you recognize that audience, that those players, they're digital native. So this idea of them embracing Web3 and so forth is not foreign to them, right? So then when they embrace that, you can monetize it. So you're building a completely digital business, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, there's still physical games, right? Like there's still a physical game.
The means of the content. Like that's the end of the means, really. It's just it gives the platform to play ball to create value around his brand of who he is as a basketball player.
Exactly. And we live in this world now where athletes, I think, are close to, if not completely, sit at the top of the creator economy, right? Like there are more Mr. Beast level athlete creators, I think, than there are sort of Mr. Beast level creators, right? And then the worlds blend. You look at like a Jake Paul who started in the pure creator world. He and his brother, in essence, you can say what you want. They are athletes as much as they're creators at this point. And they have breathed the kind of life into a combat sport that hadn't seen this kind of life since the 80s on HBO. You know what I mean? So I agree with you. I think this idea that athletes can build creator brands and creator businesses has never been a more powerful postulate.
Is the idea of being this duality, is that mandatory as to be successful as today's athlete?
Yes, and you can hire around it, but here again, I'm going to go back to that parallel between athletes and musicians. Pre-digital, you could just be a great musician. Now you needed a good manager, you needed a good producer, all that stuff. Prior generations, you could just be a great athlete, right? The best athletes and the best musicians were always great marketers, great business people, right? Like what separated Magic and Jordan from everybody else, right? They were inherently incredible marketers. You read all that stuff about, Magic used to cold call Lakers board members to find out how they got successful, right? And sort of taught himself. And those things that just a couple people were, now I think that's the difference between success and failure. Like, unfortunately, if you're just a great athlete, you probably won't see the level of success that you saw 20 years ago. Unfortunately, if you're just a great musician, you don't see the same level of success that you saw 20 years ago. If, however, you are this multi-hyphenate, the height is higher than it's ever been before. Like to be a Magic, to be a Jordan is now going to 10x what being a Magic or being a Jordan used to be.
I love that you give those examples because it encourages the listener right now or the audience member who is wondering how to take the next step if they're stuck, which is you pick up the phone call. You pick up the phone and you make the call like Magic did. Like it's you just have to do it like you started the show. Right. So, you think about the Motley Crue, Nikki Sixx, you think about these bands, these artists that were, like you said, good business people, was because they had the wherewithal to know that they had to make the call. They had to go and frankly, not really care about what anybody else thought. Just go make the call. Right.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I've had to learn as a startup CEO is like, it's like make the call on steroids. So, the biggest pivot for me, and it's frankly what made life at Activision easier, or you and I talked about both starting at creative agencies, what working at Saatchi and Saatchi made easier. So like the hard part about Activision and Saatchi was like the gatekeepers, getting in the front door. They can hire the best of the best was hard. You had to prove to them you were of their level. And especially Activision, like I think I had 12 rounds of interviews or something. Like, they really thought they were, the Jordan Chicago Bulls of video games, and they very much were. But it was very hard to get on the team. But once you were in the team, it was about inbounds. Like I didn't have to make very many outbounds. outbounds.
Mhm.
And if I made outbounds, call always return, right? When I was at Saatchi & Saatchi, leveraging Toyota as our client in the early days of digital, everybody brought a new idea to us first, or it didn't. And I called and I said I was at Saatchi on behalf of Toyota, it would be return.
Mhm.
Easy.
Mhm.
As a startup CEO, you know, I've
Humbling,
had,
isn't it?
we're going out to raise another round, and I just got a list from our fundraising partner of 497 initial outreaches we have to make in the next 30 days. Post. I'm gonna have to put my ego, my insecurities, my shyness on the line 497 times from January 2nd to January 31st.
I'll offer this publicly and offer it privately. I'd be happy to help you along the way. And what I mean by that, if that means just being in your inbox with a hello or a hey man, did you do 338 yet because you're feeling crappy today or you're feeling kind of shy today, I'm happy to be that accountability partner with you. And I mean that very, very sincerely.
Thank you.
Because
Believe me, I could use it. Because we can get into a whole other thing about the other thing I had to learn earlier in life in the great financial crisis was ask for help, right?
Yes.
Asking for help used to be one of the hardest things for me. I would never ask for help. Guess what? In 2009, I was forced to ask for help, right?
Yeah.
Forced. But it taught me something. But back to this sort of other thing, right? And it's the difference. Like, to your point about like thinking about the next day, I'm already thinking about like, I'm going to have to go like tell my story 497 times in January.
Call 500. But yes. It never changes though. I had a gentleman in the lab a couple of weeks back, Jonathan, who's won 2 Stanley Cups, played with Wayne Gretzky, some of the greatest hockey players in the world, said to me, yeah, Keith, he goes, after our call, he goes, no, earlier this morning, I was sitting in my truck for about 90 minutes trying to drum up the courage to go make the cold call.
Right.
Like you talk about reinventing oneself and being humbling, right? So it never does end. It doesn't end for any of us. It really doesn't. So you've successfully led diverse teams in your various careers, in various industries, music, digital, marketing, esports gaming. Could you share a specific challenge you faced as a leader and how you embraced it, how you overcame it, highlighting the importance of accountability and effective leadership?
Well, it's interesting because I will tell you what I learned at Activision about accountability and effective leadership and how I've tried to apply that back to startups with varying degrees of success. So when you talk about accountability, like I sort of really consider my 5.5 years at Activision as sort of like my pre-MBA, MBA.
Interesting.
And what I mean by that is like, I'd sort of come from, more creative businesses that were less KPI focused and also sort of less aggressive. Like Activision during my tenure exceeded analyst expectations every quarter. They were very good at managing Wall Street, and they really thought of themselves as the Chicago Bulls of video games. Incredibly high standards. But it was this idea of like we were a publicly traded company, and we reforecast that business 10 times a year with hardcore KPI and OKRs. And I remember for the first time in my life, bonuses went from being soft, sort of like discretionary bonuses to bonuses being like unbelievably numbers driven. Right. And what was incredible about it is if you exceeded your bonus by 1/100th of a percentage, you got the full payout. And there was none of this like shame driven, well, you just barely made it. Like the other office didn't do well, where, some of my time at ad agency was always like, well, you did great, but the office did bad or the region did poorly. So we're not going to pay out the full bonuses. If you missed by 100th at Activision, no money for you. No remorse, right? No apology. If you made by 100th, all the money for you. Like, nobody asked for it back. Nobody made you feel bad about taking the check. And it was unbelievably KPI driven. And this idea about aligning KPI through the org, right? Because what's it called? It's called the principal agent problem, right? Which is like you got this idea where you got different parts of an organization or different parts of a transaction that are incentivized in contra ways. And they were very disciplined about removing sort of principal agent, right? Where if you're the CEO or the VP of digital or a manager on Call of Duty, there were some through lines to your bonusable goals where everybody was sort of marching in the same order. And this idea, like I love that you've used the word accountability 1,000 times. It's the most accountable place I've ever worked at in my life. Now, one could argue too accountable only on one pivot, right? Which was financial. And some could argue the creative product could have been something else or the culture could have been something else. But to the idea about creative performance, unbelievably accountable and everybody held you accountable. And what I've tried to do is carry that accountability forward. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I faced in that has happened post pandemic. And it's this concept that it's become a huge debate in sort of work right now about how to keep the same level of accountability and cultural alignment in a post pandemic hybrid or remote world.
You're talking
And,
to the right guy.
and,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
and the problem of managing accountability and cultural coherence is this idea of like compound latency. And I had my last board meeting of the year last week in New York, and I raised what I thought were some cultural issues from my first year that I think we really need to resolve. And in respect for my organization and my employees, I'm going to be somewhat vague. But
Sure.
this idea of like, and they're a great team, but because we're spread between Sofia, Bulgaria, New York City, Los Angeles, other talent in other places, that there is some like compound latency, meaning I only have like 2 hours or 3 hours in the morning to work something out with Sophia. And if I have a question at noon, it doesn't get answered till I wake up the next morning. Right. Or if I ask somebody on my team in Los Angeles or New York to do something, but it's after they won't even ask until the next day. And this becomes, it's called compound latency for a reason, because it builds on itself, right? And all of a sudden it's 5 days later and the question wasn't answered because each back and forth and each exchange and each polish and each improvement was delayed by 18 hours, right? And especially in a startup where you have to move fast, I was like, why is this startup moving slower than a Fortune 500 company, right? So, and having to solve for asynchronicity, compound latency, etc. And I think the entire business world is struggling with this right now. And the idea of how do you hold a culture together, right? If you have an all hands of like 50 people and 40 of them have their cameras off, or everybody has their camera on, but you can really only see a couple of the screens. Like, is this landing? Like, is everyone hearing what I'm saying? Like, or are they checking email and they're kind of checked out? And again, I'm not saying my team, I'm talking about this, sort of theoretically, not saying that my team is doing this, but like, do we live in a world where you have to get the whole company together quarterly, right? And I've heard a lot of arguments. I've heard the argument, okay, you can save money on offices, but then if you spend all the money you were spending on offices getting the company together 4 times a year, you may be in the same space that you were. Like, I think about the problem solving that I used to do, just weaving my way the long way back to my desk from lunch at Activision through 4 floors, right? It would take me like some days 45 minutes to get back to my office because I touched like 20 people going back to my office. Or even like I talk about my spider sense, like there's 8 people in that room. Should I have been one of those 8 people in that room? Or like, what are those 4 people doing huddled over there? And I'm going to find them and I'm going to find out what went on in there. You don't know what Zoom you weren't invited to. You don't know like if that meeting went well or didn't. It's hard, right? And I think we're all, as business people, trying to solve this, respecting that at one level, work-life balance for the employee can be better the way it is, but it also depends on life stage, right? Because, and I know I'm going all over the place a little bit, people with small children seem to find some benefit in work-life balance and remoteness. And I've also had other younger single people talk to me about how they don't need that work-life balance. They don't have children to attend to or schools or daycare and that stuff. And they're desperately lacking the mentorship they used to get face to face, right? So it all depends on what phase you are in your career and what life phase you are. But I think we're trying to figure out how to recreate the most effective organizations inside this new world order of work that probably hasn't changed as much since the Industrial Revolution.
The way you ended it is the best way for me to start, because you're right. Nobody's learned anything. Nobody's been taught how to run a remote or a virtual business. Give you a little snapshot into myself, because I believe that I could help you. I started a remote virtual business in 2011.
Wow.
I had 500 people around the planet, 24/7, always on, and I never met 98% of them. My employee churn was less than 0.00085. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the point is my employees never left unless we asked them to leave. We were working with the world's biggest brands. In 2014, I wrote an article that I reflected upon a couple of years back And I wrote it 5 years before the pandemic, asking why the world wasn't working virtually, why the world wasn't using the internet to its advantage. I believe, we can even do it off camera. If you, I'll throw a few things out at you right now, but I'm happy to talk off camera with you and just give you some things to consider. But I'm respectful and I'm aware of all the challenges you speak of. And some of the, so one of the things that I would say to you and say to leaders listening is that the biggest responsibility we have as a leader, if we're going to work remotely, is in our own responsibility on the humans that we're hiring. If the human you're hiring can't drink your Kool-Aid, then you will fail. They absolutely unequivocally need to believe that you are in a results-based environment. You don't care how they get to the result. You can live anywhere on the planet. I'll give you the best life you want. And if it takes you, pardon my language, if it takes you fucking 5 years to find that person, that's kind of the trade-off, right? All this responsibility is on you to not hire children, to hire adults who you can say, here's our KPI, here's our goals, off you go. And those are harsh things to say, I'm saying right now. I'm not a fucking child. No, it's not about that. It's just about trying to find those human beings that fit the results-based environment you're looking to enable. And then the other piece of not advice, but maybe recommendation I'd throw out there from a culture perspective, Jonathan, and I know it worked well for us, and I was involved in a conversation yesterday, was really enabling the human being, like really being empathetic and empowering them as a human being, that I want you to be the best human you can be. So how can I do that for you? Okay, great. Awesome. Now let's go and focus on how you being the best human being can contribute Clash TV being the greatest company, right? And I have found that the more that I gave back to you as the human, right? The human, like really connect. So human wellness, moving, doing walking meetings, doing performance reviews on a hike, like bringing people together for a purpose, but a human purpose, not I brought my teams to Vegas, but never to sit in boardrooms, always to go and have fun and build culture, build, some things together. And then the other little bit of advice I would offer in terms of the compounded latency, and a great term is, and I reflected upon this on the recent Lex Fridman podcast where he talked with Bezos. I would encourage you to go into meetings not knowing when they're an end. And I would encourage you to go into your meetings with your people saying, we have a problem to solve and we can't end the discussion until the problem is solved. So if that means the meeting goes 3 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, and I know we got time zones we got to contend with, but guys, we got to buckle up here. We're not talking days or weeks, we're talking hours now. And yes, so it's going to be difficult, but those are the kind of conversations you might want to have with the team, saying, okay, we got a problem to solve here. We need to solve it in the next 14 hours. Over the next 14 hours, we're going to take some breaks. We're going to do this. I know you got some kids, but if we can solve it in the next 14 hours, we can get it done instead of the next 10 days, right? So it's really acknowledging that there's a problem to solve and we got to solve it. Then the last thing I give you, and I'm a big believer in this too, my friend, is stop using PowerPoints and stop asking people to think in bullet points. You came from creative and so did I. You came from the marketing industry and so did I. It's the laziest thing we can ask our people to do. I would often encourage my people, if we were working here, hey, Jonathan, yeah, I need a memo from you so we can meet next Monday. I want you to take the next 2 hours, I want you to take, put all your thought in so that we can have an honest discussion around your thoughts instead of your bullet points that then we got to kind of talk through. So it's like putting all the work in advance, right? So I'm not trying to lecture. I'm just offering some.
No, this is great.
This is great. I worked for me, right? And one of them really was just and I'll tell you, I really think you have the magic, if I can offer this to you, in your own mirror, because of how authentic you are. You strike me a lot like myself. People will drink your Kool-Aid because they can buy into your energy and buy into who you are as a human being. I really believe the more human you are for your people, the more human you make them, the more they're going to buy into your culture.
I think you're right on that. I think the learning that I have to do is my authenticity can come with a level of bluntness that can look like harshness and negativity. That is then off-putting, and I own that. And that's like one of the things that I'm working on.
That's a communication skill though, right? And I've been there with you. That's called brushing the spurs off the edges, my friend.
Right.
Start a podcast because you become a better listener and you become a better communicator. And I can help you with that too, because it's helped me with that whole idea, right? Is asking thoughtful questions and trying to rough the spurs off the edges, right?
Right. Because you want to be authentic, but you have to paint, especially in a startup, a positive picture, right? You're asking people. It's interesting. I was talking to this startup CEO. They're further along than we are. They raised $50 million at a $500 million valuation. And I was talking about my struggles sort of running a remote company, having spent the great bulk of my career in sort of, co-located company. I mean, we had global offices, Right. But there were still, whatever, 500 people in your office, whatever. And you spent a lot of time on planes going to other, local offices. And he was talking about, he's like, I can't be negative. Like if I'm negative, it like crushes people.
Yes.
It crushes them. And I was like, well, when you have a problem, how do you talk about it without being negative? And it was just interesting to see that, like, to your point about the Kool-Aid, it's like, and I also think it's generational to some degree. Like I'm Gen X, we're naturally fucking cynical, right? And like
I-
cynicism like is wired in me. Like I always tell people, like, you can't be too blunt to me, like, you can't hurt my feelings, and it's interesting. I was talking to a CEO who's running a gaming company in Europe, and he's like primarily, Gen Y, Gen Z, and he's like, we had a travel problem. And by a travel problem, I meant we were spending way too much money on travel. And I tried to present it to the company in a P&L perspective, right? And he's like, we'd have these really open conversations. This is a percent of revenue that's going to travel. And he's like, I'd force rank people's travel and put it in a PowerPoint slide. And he's like, I was always the worst offender. Like I was always at the top of the list. And I'd always be like, I'm the worst offender. And when he framed it in a profit motive, nothing changed, right? Nothing. And they reframed it in a carbon footprint argument.
Mm.
And he came back and he's sort of like, well, we're really trying to work on our carbon footprint as a company. And the biggest problem that we have as a company from carbon footprint is travel. He's like, in 6 months, travel plummeted 50%. He's like, almost so far that I'm begging people to travel. I was like, you really need to go to London. And they're like, oh, my carbon footprint. And it's this idea that like everybody else isn't motivated the same way you are. Everybody else isn't wired the same way you are.
Well,
And he's wired about profit, but he's like, oh, I get it. My employee base is motivated by cause, and I'm going to judo flip this problem into a cause-based problem. I'm going to solve my profit-based problem by presenting it as a cause-based problem.
Yes. Well, and you as a marketer, you know that it's about
Yeah.
narrative and messaging and
Yeah.
getting the right message in front of the audience, right? It troubles me that people look at profit as a bad word. And I know even when I was working in the past, with my old business, we had to be careful with that narrative because you're right, Jonathan. It doesn't motivate anybody, frankly. Unless you're the owner of the business who's getting the money, it doesn't motivate unless you make it the culture. I don't know if you heard the recent podcast on Lenny's podcast with Jason Fried, the founder of Basecamp 37 Signals, and he goes, "We're all about profit, but that's been from the culture from day one, right?" So when you're sitting down for an interview, I'm saying, "Hey, Jonathan, we're trying to make the most money we can." Okay, great. That's why I signed up, right? But if somebody comes in later and they're thinking profit, no, man, carbon footprint's more important to me, then you're going to miss the nail on that one, right? So,
right.
The other bit of advice or offering I would give to you is that, and you probably know this, but sometimes it's helpful to hear this, is that those remote relationships, unlike the boardroom, you really proactively have to work them.
Yep.
So it's looking at your calendar and go, okay, I need to go and carve out 10 minutes today for Steve, because I know when you take that 10 minutes done with Steve, I've given Steve 24 hours of fuel now to get him going again. That's what I was bad at and had to get good at in my old world, was being reminded of, no, Lisa wants to hear from you. Even give her 5 minutes, because those 5 minutes give her energy for the next week, right? And
I completely agree with you, and it's so hard. It's like, and it's not like everybody's busy. So believe me, I'm not saying like life is harder as like a CEO or a C-level, but that's hard. I mean, it's interesting because I'm already looking at like, where can I carve out in January to fly to Sofia, right, and spend a few days with the team in Bulgaria. But it's interesting because I did one of these executive like team building offsites, and we did an exercise once where they put 3 groups of people, and this was a mix of like current leaders, mid-level people, and rising stars, and they mixed them up, and we weren't told what the exercise was. And the first group of people they put on a platform, and they tied us all up in a rope, and they handed us like a clue, and we had to sort of solve the clue. And the second group of people they put on a platform, and they were blindfolded, and they couldn't see what was going on, and they had like the answer to the clue, right, but they didn't know what people were doing. And then the third group of people were like, they weren't allowed to talk, and it was trying to get everybody on the same platform, right? And of course it was an abject failure, and nobody did it. And it became a metaphor for, the people tied up in the rope were senior management, and they thought they were solving a problem, right? Because they were told, when you solve this thing, you get the ropes off and you can use the ropes to get the other people over. But they were so tied up in solving the problem, they couldn't see that some people couldn't hear and some people couldn't talk. And all those people on the 2 other platforms felt abandoned, pissed off, ignored, minimized. And that was supposed to be the lesson, right? If you're senior management, you think you're off solving all these important problems. And if you're just focused on that, you've lost everybody else. They feel abandoned, right? And the lesson for the people who can't talk is you're like middle management and you see what senior management's doing, but you can't really tell the workers, right? They're trying to sell the company. It's why they're not paying attention to you, but they're not allowed to say that, right? And then you're supposed to realize like the voiceless people were like the rank and file employees. I'm sorry, the people who can't see are like the rank and file employees, and they just feel abandoned, right? They have no idea, like they're just all they know is they're abandoned, right? And I think to your point about finding that time, that's the learning from that I keep forgetting because I get busy wrapped up in ropes trying to solve the equation that like, yeah, I've just abandoned everybody.
And that's
And no wonder they're not. No wonder there's all these problems because I've abandoned them. It's not their problem. It's not their fault. It's my fault.
so perhaps the way to frame it is looking at it instead of compound latency, you can give them compound fuel, right?
Yes.
So if you say to yourselves, I'm going to give out, I don't know how big's your team, Jonathan?
When we're in full production, we've got like 55 people on a regular basis. It's like 25.
So if you're able to find, throughout your week, enough time to go to 55 people, right? Even if it's a minute per person, that's an hour a day. Now it's unrealistic, but you kind of start thinking the numbers here.
Yeah.
Those minutes become compounded, right? Because when you talk to Joe on Wednesday for a minute or 2 minutes, you got Joe going now for the next week till you talk to him again, right? So it's using your voice, your energy to compound everybody else's energy to move for you till the next time you meet them, right? Maybe think about it that way. So when you're thinking about compound latency, think of, okay, I got to go throw some fuel on their fire so that they can come back to me. I don't know.
That's great. It's great advice. And throwing, to your point, the right fuel, right? It's easy to throw where the hell is that? The deadline's late. The deadline was 2 days ago. Why do I have to follow up on this? That's the wrong kind of fuel, right? It's like you got to throw the right kind of fuel on there.
And I'll offer this to you as well. And I know this is difficult as a CEO, especially a startup CEO, that if somebody's always failing you or letting you down and you keep being patient about it, it's never going to change. So then the most difficult thing is trying to take a step back, find the replacement, right? Because we both know the greatest challenge to creating successful companies is finding the extremely right human beings around you.
Right.
Because you spend more time accepting somebody's excuses or failures because we as leaders are going, fuck, I don't want to take the next 6 months trying to find somebody. I just want to get this person going right now because I got to go to a board meeting tomorrow, right? That's sometimes the hardest decision we have to make, right? So, hey man, I've taken a lot of your time and I've really thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, thoroughly enjoyed the energy that you've brought to the table. Jonathan, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you want to throw out there that the audience needs to know about, should know about? We talk about Clash TV. This is your chance to put some stuff out there, promote it, pump it up before we work towards saying goodbye together.
I appreciate that. What I'd sort of like to do is feedback how much I think the attitude you bring to this aligns with what it would take for anybody in my position to succeed. Like I was getting amped up just kind of sitting in the waiting room, hearing you talk about accountability, like hearing you talking about putting in the work. Like, I think all of us, and by the way, I sort of feel like, I'm thanking you for this time. Like I got a lot of actionable sort of like, how to improve as a leader kind of coming out of this. Mm-hmm. And so, the wrap up that I would like to give is thank you for the focus on accountability. Thank you for sort of the focus on like the grit and putting the next step in and trying to pivot on these ways of thinking, because that's how we're all going to get better, right? Like, I went to college at 22, not 18. I went to business school 20 years into my career, right? I just learned something from you. This idea of like,
it's a thing for you though, isn't it? Like that, it's an instant. I mean this with respect. It's an insecurity, isn't it? This because you brought it up a number of times on the call here, and I like making people feel safe in the room. And you've clearly said a number of times that I've been catching up my whole life, pal. Let me say to you, brother to brother, you're there's no catching up anymore, man. Fuck, we're in our 50s, brother. We're in our 50s. There's no catching up.
Thank you. But the broader point is like never stop learning. Like you're never, as soon as you think you're done with learning, you're dead. As soon as I was listening to this Joe Rogan thing, right? And he was talking about like why people our age have to lift all the time, right? Like why I have to lift heavy things. Like I try to lift heavy things all the time.
I do every day.
And he's like, I do too, but he's like, because aging is like this evil, quiet thing, and it's like it's biting at you every day. And if
Yes.
you and like lifting heavy things, if you don't, you're gonna wake up one day and it's like, why can't I stand up in the chair? Like, why did that hurt? Like, why can I not lift my kid anymore? Right. And it's like, and to me, that sort of like push and that learning, like if as soon as you stop doing it, it's over.
Mm. I love the gym as the ultimate metaphor in life
Yeah.
because when you go there, 45 pounds is 45 pounds, whether you're white, black, Chinese, Asian, green, female, male, whatever you are, it's 45 pounds and it's the same weight for all of us. And to your point, it's much lighter when you're in your 30s and probably get a lot of testosterone than when you're in your 60s. And that's what motivates me too, is going, okay, I got to keep trying to lift that weight because I'm only getting older.
Totally, because the explanation point on that piece, that metaphor, which, I don't know if he invented it, but I've taken from Henry Rollins, is that 45 pounds. Every day, that weight is the same. The difference is you.
Yeah. You're going to get the last word. I got nothing to say on that one. So if that's Henry Rollins or yourself, but you get the last word. Jonathan Anastas, thanks for joining me today live in the lab.
Thank you.
Very, very grateful. Full of vitamin G for your visit today. I'm going to stick you off in the green room, pivot over here to say goodbye to the audience and come back and walk you out. All right?
All right. Thank you.
Hang tight. Do this here. You guys know how all this works. Going to go this here, bring up the single and say goodbye. What a wonderful chat. We went into overtime. I said this yesterday. I never know when I sit down in the chair here where the conversation is going to go, how it's going to go. I don't have a script. My ambition is to have great conversation with interesting people to inspire all of you. I learned a lot today. I left really inspired. Love Jonathan's music story. Truthfully, to you guys listening, I probably could have made the whole show on music and punk rock and that whole industry. So maybe we have to have him back. But I know I'll get shit from my team here that I'm not sticking to the content topics that we're speaking to. But I know you guys want to hear this stuff. So we'll keep talking about it along the way. So we'll leave that there. We'll see you guys tomorrow live in the lab with another guest. Tomorrow's Thursday. We're bringing up on the calendar tomorrow. I'm going to pull it up here quickly. We're talking next steps here. Next step tomorrow, Thursday. Andrew Petcast joins me live in the lab. You know where we're at. YouTube, X, LinkedIn, and find us inside.bapl.ai, Monday to Friday, noon Central. I'm Keith Bilous. I'm out of here. I'm going to go set up a next step with Jonathan. See you guys tomorrow.